Trust me, you won't forget this one. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What I'm about to tell you happened in a mansion worth $12 million, in front of caterers, waiters, and a room full of people who called themselves important. A woman was tied to a kitchen chair. Her head had just been shaved out of pure rage. And the man who was supposed to marry the woman who did it was about to walk through that door. Nobody in that house knew what he was about to find. Nobody knew how much it would cost them. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country are you in? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional, most unexpected ones I've ever shared on this channel. It's about power, cruelty, and one woman who had absolutely nothing, except the truth. Stay with me till the end, because what happens in this house will stay with you long after the video ends. Nobody ever suspected that a single Tuesday afternoon could unravel a $12 million life. Maya Johnson was 29 years old, and for the last 3 years, she had been the head housekeeper at the Whitfield estate, a sprawling white stone mansion tucked into the hills outside Greenwich, Connecticut. She arrived every morning at 6, before the sun had fully climbed over the tree line, and she left most nights well after the household had gone quiet. She ironed shirts that cost more than her monthly rent. She polished silverware that had been in the Whitfield family for 3 generations. She learned, without ever being told directly, that in this house she was meant to be invisible. Nathaniel Whitfield, Nate, as his closest friends called him, was 37 years old, and he had built an empire out of nothing but a business degree, a stubborn refusal to fail, and an instinct for real estate that made grown men in tailored suits nervous when they sat across from him at the negotiating table. He was polite to Maya in the way wealthy men are polite to staff they barely notice. A nod in the hallway, a quiet thank you when his coffee was ready. He didn't know her last name until almost a year into her employment. He didn't know she had a mother in hospice care 2 towns over, paying for treatment on a housekeeper's salary. He didn't know much about her at all. What Nate did know, or thought he knew, was that he was about to marry the perfect woman. Vanessa Cole was 32, blonde, sharp-jawed, and stunning in the specific camera-ready way that made heads turn at charity galas. She had grown up 2 towns over from the Whitfield estate, in a house that was large but not large enough, with parents who had drilled into her, from the time she could walk, that marrying well was the only kind of success that mattered. When she met Nate at a fundraiser 18 months earlier, she had looked at him the way a person looks at the answer to a problem they've been solving their whole life. Within 4 months there was a ring. Within a year, there was a wedding date circled on a calendar in gold ink. To the outside world, Vanessa was gracious, warm, the kind of woman who remembered your children's names and sent thank you cards after every dinner party. But behind the closed doors of the Whitfield estate, when Nate was traveling for business, which was often, Vanessa became someone else entirely. He hated Maya. Not for anything Maya had done. She hated her for existing in a way Vanessa couldn't control. Had started small. A comment about how Maya folded the towels. A complaint that the flowers in the foyer weren't fresh enough, even though Maya had replaced them herself that morning. Then it grew. Vanessa began finding reasons to summon Maya into rooms just to criticize her, just to watch her stand there and take it, because Maya needed the job too much to push back. Maya's mother's medical bills didn't care about dignity. They only cared about the paycheck that came every 2 weeks. And that paycheck came from this house. On this particular Tuesday, Nate was 3 states away, closing a deal that had taken him 6 months to negotiate. He had told Vanessa he'd be home by dinner. He had no idea what would happen in the hours before that. It began with a stain. Vanessa had found a small mark on the hem of her wedding dress, the dress that hung in a private, climate-controlled closet the dress that had cost more than Maya's annual salary combined. She was convinced, with no evidence at all, that Maya had touched it while cleaning, that Maya had ruined it. Maya hadn't been anywhere near that closet in days. It didn't matter. Vanessa's voice, when she called for her, had a pitch to it that Maya had learned to recognize. The sound of someone who had already decided guilt before asking a single question. "You did this," Vanessa said, holding up the dress with shaking hands. Her face flushed red beneath her perfect makeup. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" "Ma'am, I haven't touched your dress," Maya said quietly, keeping her eyes low. Her hands folded in front of her apron the way she always did when Vanessa's temper flared. "I don't even have a key to that closet. Don't lie to me." Vanessa's voice cracked with something that wasn't just anger. It was years of pressure, of insecurity, of a woman who had built her entire identity on being chosen, being perfect, being enough. And in that moment, staring at a stain that may not have even been real, all of it came pouring out onto the one person in the house who couldn't fight back. What Maya didn't know, what nobody in that house knew yet, was that this Tuesday would be the day everything changed. Not just for her. For everyone standing in that kitchen when the front door finally opened. Because Nate wasn't 3 states away anymore. His flight had landed 4 hours early. Nobody saw the black car pull into the driveway. Maya's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her voice steady, kept repeating the same simple truth. She hadn't touched the dress, she didn't know how the mark got there, she would never damage something that wasn't hers to damage. But steady truth means nothing to someone who has already made up her mind. And Vanessa had made up her mind the moment she saw that stain and needed someone else to blame for the panic clawing up her throat. "Sit down," Vanessa said. Maya blinked. "Ma'am." "I said sit down." Vanessa pointed to a plain wooden chair near the small television in the staff kitchen. The modest room tucked behind the main house where Maya took her 15-minute lunch breaks, where she kept a photo of her mother taped inside a cabinet door so she'd see it during the hardest shifts. Maya's stomach turned, but she sat. Not because she believed she'd done anything wrong. She sat because in 3 years working in this house, she had learned that refusing Vanessa in a moment like this only made things worse, and worse was not something Maya could afford. Not with her mother's hospital bills stacking up like a second job she never asked for. What happened next? Maya would replay in her mind for years. Vanessa grabbed the kitchen shears from the drawer, the same ones Maya used to trim herb stems for the family's dinner salads. And before Maya could fully understand what was happening, Vanessa was standing behind her, breathing hard, muttering something about respect, about knowing her place, about how people like you never appreciate what you're given. Maya felt the first cold snip near her ear and froze completely, too shocked to even scream. Her hands gripping the sides of the chair so hard her knuckles went white. "Please," Maya whispered, tears sliding silently down her face. "Please, I didn't do anything." Vanessa didn't stop. Whether it was rage, humiliation, or some deep unraveling thread inside her that had been fraying for months, she kept going, clump after clump of Maya's dark curls falling onto the tile floor, until what was left was uneven, jagged, and Maya sat there trembling, stripped of something that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with dignity. It was in that exact moment, Vanessa standing over Maya, shears still in hand, breathing hard, the floor scattered with hair, that the door to the staff kitchen opened. Nate stood in the doorway. His suit jacket was still on. His travel bag was still slung over one shoulder. His flight had landed early, and he'd wanted to surprise Vanessa, wanted to walk into his own home and catch his fiancée off guard with flowers he still held loosely in one hand, now forgotten, hanging at his side. For 3 full seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nate's eyes went from the shears in Vanessa's hand, to the hair scattered across the floor, to Maya, bound to that chair with the kitchen's spare length of clothesline rope. Her face bruised faintly along one cheekbone from an earlier moment nobody outside that room had witnessed, tears streaking silently down her face, her head half-shaved in a way that made his stomach twist violently. "Vanessa," Nate said, and his voice was so quiet, so controlled, that it was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "What is this?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand wrapped in disbelief. Vanessa's face went through 3 expressions in the space of a single breath. Shock at being caught, a flash of defensiveness, and then, quickly, the practiced softness she always slipped on like a second skin around Nate. "Baby, you don't understand. She ruined my dress. She's been stealing from us for months. I finally caught her and—" "Untie her," Nate said. "Nate, untie her right now." His voice cracked like a whip through the small kitchen, and for the first time since Maya had known him, she heard something in his tone that wasn't polite distance. It was fury, barely contained. Vanessa's hands shook as she fumbled with the rope, her explanations spilling out faster and faster, each one more desperate than the last, but Nate wasn't listening anymore. He had crossed the room and knelt in front of Maya, his eyes moving over the bruise on her cheek, the uneven, violent lengths of her hair, the rope burns forming on her wrists. "Who did this to your face?" he asked her quietly. "Not Vanessa. Maya." Maya opened her mouth, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't sure if telling the truth in this house would save her, or destroy the only stability she had left. Maya's throat tightened around the words. She had learned, in 3 years of working for the Whitfield family, that the wealthy rarely wanted the whole truth. They wanted a version of the truth that didn't inconvenience them, didn't force them to choose between comfort and justice. And Nate, kind as he sometimes seemed in passing hallway moments, was still the man about to marry the woman standing 3 feet away with kitchen shears still clutched in her trembling hand. But something in his eyes stopped Maya from swallowing the lie. "She did," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ma'am, Vanessa. The bruise happened 2 days ago. When I moved a vase she said I broke on purpose. She grabbed my arm and I fell against the counter." Maya's voice shook harder with every word, like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure. "Today she said I stained her wedding dress. I never touched it. I don't even have the key to that closet. She tied me to this chair and Maya's hand rose slowly to what remained of her hair, and the sentence dissolved into silence because there was nothing left to explain. The floor said it for her. Nate stood up slowly. When he turned to face Vanessa, something in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 2 days ago," he repeated. "You told me she dropped a vase and it was an accident." "It was an accident, Nate, I swear You just what? Grabbed her hard enough to bruise her arm. And today you tied a woman to a chair and cut off her hair because of a stain you're not even sure she caused." His voice rose with every sentence, disbelief curdling into something darker. "Do you hear yourself right now? She's staff, Nate." Vanessa's composure finally cracked completely, her voice climbing into something shrill and desperate. "This is how it works. You don't understand because you didn't grow up having to fight for everything you have. People like her don't just get to disrespect people like us and face no consequences." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Maya had ever heard. Nate looked at Vanessa the way a person looks at a stranger, someone whose face is familiar but whose insides have suddenly, violently, revealed themselves to be something entirely different than what he'd imagined for 18 months. Something he had built a future on top of, without ever truly seeing the foundation underneath. "People like us," he said slowly, testing the words like they tasted foreign in his mouth. "Vanessa. My grandfather started this family's money working double shifts in a steel mill in Pittsburgh. My mother cleaned houses for 6 years before she opened her own business. There is no people like us that includes tying a human being to a chair and shaving her head because you were embarrassed about a stain on a dress. You're twisting this. I'm not twisting anything. I'm looking at rope burns on her wrists. Nate's voice had gone dangerously quiet again, and this time Maya understood. This quiet wasn't calm. It was the sound of a man doing everything in his power not to lose control completely. He turned back to Maya and gently, so gently it made fresh tears spring to her eyes after everything she just endured. He began working at the last of the rope himself, his jaw tight, his hands surprisingly careful despite the barely restrained anger radiating off him. "I am so sorry," he said to her, low enough that it felt like it was meant only for her. "This should have never happened in my house. Not for 1 second." Maya couldn't speak. She just nodded, her wrists finally free, rubbing at the raw red marks left behind by the rope. Behind them, Vanessa's voice had shifted again, panic replacing indignation now that she understood, perhaps for the first time, that Nate wasn't going to simply smooth this over the way he'd smoothed over so many of her outbursts before. "Nate, please think about what this looks like. Think about the wedding, think about what people will say if this gets out." "What people will say?" Nate repeated, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it at all. "Vanessa, I don't care what people say. I care that you hurt someone who has worked in this house for 3 years without a single complaint, someone who has always been kind to every person who walks through that door, and you tied her to a chair like she wasn't a human being." He helped Maya to her feet, steadying her when her legs shook beneath her from shock. And then he said the words that would change the trajectory of everyone standing in that room. "Vanessa, I think you need to leave. Tonight." Vanessa's face went white. "You don't mean that." But the terrible, quiet certainty in Nate's eyes said that he absolutely did. What Vanessa didn't know, what nobody in that kitchen knew yet, was that this wasn't the first time Nate had quietly investigated a member of his household staff's treatment. 6 months earlier, a housekeeper who worked the West Wing had come to him in tears, describing a pattern of small cruelties from Vanessa that she'd been too afraid to report through official channels. Nate had spoken to Vanessa about it then. She had cried, apologized, promised it would never happen again, and Nate, wanting badly to believe the woman he loved was fundamentally good, just stressed, just adjusting to a new kind of life, had let it go. He had chalked it up to wedding pressure. He had chosen, in the quiet way people choose to protect a version of someone they've fallen for, not to look too closely. Standing in that kitchen now, staring at Maya's uneven hair and reddened wrists, Nate understood with a sick, sinking clarity that he had made a terrible mistake by looking away 6 months ago. His silence back then had made this moment possible. "Get your things," he told Vanessa. His voice flat now, drained of the fury and replaced with something colder. Exhaustion, disappointment, the specific grief of watching a future you'd built crumble in real time. "I'll have security escort you to the guest house tonight. We'll discuss the rest tomorrow through lawyers." "Lawyers," Vanessa repeated, disbelief cracking through her voice. "Nate, this is insane. You're really going to throw away 18 months over a housekeeper?" The word landed wrong in the room, and Nate's expression hardened further. "Her name is Maya," he said. "And no, Vanessa. I'm not throwing away 18 months over a housekeeper. I'm ending an engagement because I just watched the woman I was going to marry restrain and mutilate another human being in my own home, and try to justify it to my face like it was reasonable. That's not a small thing to walk back from. That's not something I can unsee." Vanessa's face crumpled, real tears finally spilling, whether from genuine remorse or the sudden terrifying reality of losing the life she'd spent years building toward. Even Maya, watching from the chair she'd just been freed from, couldn't tell. Grief and self-preservation can look remarkably similar on a desperate face. "I'll fix this," Vanessa said, her voice breaking. I'll apologize to her, I'll get her anything she needs, I'll pay for. Nate, please, just give me a chance to fix this. But Nate was already turned toward Maya, his attention entirely elsewhere. And that, more than anything he'd said, seemed to finally break through Vanessa's denial. She wasn't the center of this moment anymore. For the first time in the entire relationship, she wasn't the one being protected. Maya, Nate said gently. Is there someone I can call for you? Family, a friend. Someone who can come sit with you tonight. Maya shook her head slowly, still trembling, still processing the whiplash of the last 20 minutes. Terror, humiliation, and now this unexpected, unfamiliar gentleness from a man she'd barely spoken 50 words to in 3 years. My mother, she finally said, her voice hoarse. She's sick. She's in hospice. I don't really have anyone else close by. Something shifted in Nate's face at that. A flicker of recognition, maybe, of how alone a person could be even while surrounded by other people's wealth. Okay, he said softly. Let's get you checked out by a doctor first, just to be safe. Then I'll have my driver take you wherever you need to go. And Maya. He paused, meeting her eyes directly for what felt like the first time in 3 years. I am going to make this right. I promise you that. Maya didn't know yet how much those words would come to mean. She didn't know that within a week, her mother's hospice bills would be quietly paid in full. She didn't know that Nate would personally call every housekeeping staff member in that mansion, one by one, to ask if they had ever experienced anything similar and had simply been too afraid to speak up. She didn't know how many similar stories he would hear before the night was over, or how deeply it would shake him. All she knew, sitting in that kitchen with half her hair gone and her wrists raw, was that for the first time since she'd started working in that house, someone with power had chosen to see her. The days that followed the mansion's front doors closing on Vanessa Cole for the last time were unlike anything the Whitfield staff had ever experienced. Word moved through the household the way it always does in large homes, with many hands working quietly behind the scenes. Fast and in careful whispers. The gardener heard it from the chef. The chef heard it from the driver. By the following morning, every person who worked at the Whitfield estate knew that Vanessa Cole's engagement to Nathaniel Whitfield was over, and that it had ended because of what she'd done to Maya. What surprised the staff most wasn't that the engagement had ended. It was what Nate did next. He called a full staff meeting, something that had never happened in the 3 years Maya had worked there, and stood in front of nearly 20 employees, from the housekeeping team to the groundskeepers, and said something none of them expected to hear from a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I failed you, he told them plainly, his hands resting on the back of a dining chair. His voice steady but heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. Not just Maya. All of you. I built a life in this house without ever really asking the people who kept it running whether they were safe here, whether they were treated with the respect they deserved. That ends now. If anyone in this room has ever experienced mistreatment, from Vanessa, from myself, from anyone, I want to hear about it. Not because I'm looking for more reasons to feel guilty. Because I want to fix what's broken in this house before it breaks someone else the way it broke Maya this week. The room was silent for a long moment. Then slowly one voice spoke up. Then another. Stories neither Nate nor Maya had ever heard. Small cruelties, dismissive comments, moments of casual disrespect that staff had swallowed silently for fear of losing jobs they desperately needed. None of it was as severe as what happened to Maya, but all of it painted a picture of a household culture that had quietly rotted under Vanessa's influence while Nate traveled for business, blind to what was happening behind his own walls. Maya sat near the back of the room during that meeting, still adjusting to the unfamiliar shortness of her hair, still healing from the emotional weight of what had happened. She hadn't expected to feel anything watching Nate speak, but something in his willingness to stand in front of his entire staff and admit failure, publicly without deflecting blame, cracked something open in her that 3 years of quiet servitude had sealed shut. After the meeting, Nate asked to speak with her privately in his study. "I owe you more than an apology," he told her, once the door was closed and it was just the two of them. "I've already had my legal team draft a settlement, full coverage of your mother's medical expenses moving forward for as long as she needs care. And I want you to know your job here is secure for as long as you want it, at whatever role you choose. Housekeeping if that's what you prefer. Or something else entirely, if there's something else you've always wanted to do." Maya blinked, caught off guard. "Mr. Whitfield, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," he said gently. "I just needed you to know that what happened wasn't your fault, and that this house is going to be different from now on. I should have made sure of that a long time ago." There was something in his voice. Not pity, not performative guilt, but genuine quiet resolve, that made Maya believe him in a way she hadn't expected to believe anyone in this house again. But what neither of them knew yet was that Vanessa wasn't finished. Not even close. 2 nights later, a story would leak to a local gossip outlet, framing Maya as a manipulative employee who had fabricated the entire incident to seduce her way into a billionaire's inheritance. And somewhere across town, in a rented apartment funded by her parents' dwindling savings, Vanessa Cole would sit reading the comments underneath that story with a small, satisfied smile, believing, for the first time since that kitchen door opened, that she might still come out of this untouched. She had no idea what Nate was already quietly preparing. The article appeared on a small local gossip site 2 nights later, under a headline dripping with implication. "Whitfield heir's engagement collapses amid staff scandal. Sources say housekeeper orchestrated it all." By morning, it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. By noon, it had a life of its own, spreading across social media with a particular cruelty reserved for stories about wealthy men and the women around them. Comment sections filled with strangers who knew nothing about Maya's life speculating wildly. That she'd planned the whole thing, that she'd manufactured the injuries, that women like her always found a way to trap rich men. Maya read exactly 3 comments before she closed her phone and didn't open it again for the rest of the day. She sat on the edge of her small apartment bed, hands shaking, and for the first time since the incident in the kitchen, she cried. Not from fear this time, but from the crushing unfairness of it all. She had done nothing except survive an assault, and now the internet had decided she was the villain in her own story. Nate saw the article within an hour of it going live. He was in his study, a cup of coffee going cold beside him, when his assistant forwarded it with a short message. "This is bad. We need a statement." He read it twice, jaw tightening with every paragraph. There was no mistaking the source. Only a handful of people knew the specific details in that article. The timeline, the wording, the exact framing designed to protect one person's reputation while destroying another's. It had Vanessa's fingerprints all over it, even though her name appeared nowhere in the piece. He called his lawyer within the hour. Then he did something his PR team advised strongly against. He sat down and wrote a statement himself in his own words, and posted it publicly under his own name instead of hiding behind a corporate press release. 3 days ago, my former fiancée restrained and forcibly cut the hair of a member of my household staff, a woman named Maya Johnson, following an earlier incident where she was physically injured. I witnessed the aftermath myself. Maya did nothing to provoke either incident. She has worked in my home for 3 years with nothing but professionalism and kindness, and she deserves better than to be dragged through public speculation for surviving mistreatment in a house that should have protected her. I take full responsibility for not recognizing this pattern sooner. Any further questions about this matter should be directed to my legal team, not to Maya, who has already endured more than enough. The statement spread even faster than the gossip article had. Within hours, the narrative flipped entirely. News outlets that had run speculative pieces the day before scrambled to publish updated stories. Public sentiment, which had briefly painted Maya as a scheming opportunist, turned sharply, and painfully for Vanessa, in the opposite direction. What followed was something Vanessa hadn't accounted for at all. Consequences that extended beyond Nate's front door. Her name began surfacing in comment threads despite never being mentioned in Nate's statement, connected by internet sleuths piecing together timelines and old society page photos. Her family's small real estate business, which relied heavily on referrals and local reputation, began fielding uncomfortable questions from longtime clients. 2 friends she'd considered close quietly stopped returning her calls. The life she had spent years carefully constructing, a life built on being chosen, being seen as worthy, being enough, was unraveling in exactly the public way she had once used to threaten Nate into silence. Sitting alone in her rented apartment 3 days after the article broke, Vanessa finally understood something that hadn't occurred to her in that kitchen. Hadn't occurred to her in 18 months of dating a man whose kindness she had mistaken for weakness. Some people, when finally pushed far enough, don't fold. They rebuild stronger, and they take the truth with them wherever they go next. She picked up her phone one final time and typed a message to Nate. Not an apology. Not yet. Just 3 words. We need to talk. Nate never responded. 2 weeks passed. Maya returned to work at the Whitfield estate slowly, cautiously, still adjusting to the strange new reality of walking through those same hallways, knowing the house had shifted beneath her feet in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her hair had begun to grow back in soft, uneven patches that she covered with a simple head wrap most days, not out of shame anymore, but because she liked how it looked on her. A small, quiet reclaiming of something that had been taken from her by force. Nate had kept every promise. Her mother's hospice care was fully covered, with a note from the facility director confirming an anonymous endowment had been established to extend her care indefinitely. Maya's paycheck had increased without her asking. But more than any of that, something in the house itself had changed. The atmosphere, the way staff spoke to one another, the way Nate himself moved through the halls now, stopping to ask people's names, their stories, their lives outside the walls of his estate. One afternoon, he found her in the garden room, arranging fresh flowers for the dining table, a task she'd taken back on herself once the initial shock had faded. "Can I ask you something?" he said, standing in the doorway the way he always did now, never entering a room without acknowledging her presence first, something that had never occurred to the old version of him. Maya looked up. "Of course, Mr. Whitfield." "Nate," he corrected gently, the way he had every day for the past 2 weeks. "Please." She allowed herself a small smile. "Nate, what did you want to ask? You said that day that you didn't have anyone close by. No family besides your mother." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I know this might be strange coming from me considering everything, but I wanted to ask if you have thought at all about what you want. Not for this house, not for your job here, but for your life. If none of this had happened, what would you have wanted to do?" The question caught Maya off guard in a way few things had since that Tuesday afternoon. Nobody had asked her that in years. She had spent so long simply surviving, working, caring for her mother, sending money, existing quietly in the corners of other people's grand lives, that she had almost forgotten she was allowed to want something for herself. "I studied nursing for 2 years, she admitted quietly, almost surprised to hear herself say it out loud. "Before my mother got sick and I had to leave school to help pay for her care. I always thought I'd go back one day. I just never had the money or the time." Something shifted in Nate's expression. Not pity, but a kind of quiet determination that Maya was starting to recognize as simply who he was underneath the wealth and the suits and the boardrooms. "What if you had both now?" Maya blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the estate covered the cost of you finishing your nursing degree? on a flexible schedule that works around whatever role you want here, or doesn't have to involve this house at all if you'd rather move on entirely. I want to make something right, Maya. Not because I feel sorry for you. Because you deserve a life that's actually yours. Not just one built around surviving someone else's. For a long moment, Maya couldn't speak. 3 years of swallowed dignity, of quiet endurance, of believing this was simply the shape her life was destined to take. And here was a door swinging open she hadn't let herself imagine walking through in years. "Why are you doing all this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't owe me this much." Nate was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden beyond the window, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that told her this wasn't a decision made lightly, or out of guilt alone. "Because I spent 18 months building a life with someone who taught me that power means never having to answer for how you treat people beneath you. And I don't want to build the rest of my life on those terms. Helping you rebuild what was taken from you isn't charity, Maya. It's the bare minimum of what should have happened the moment you were hired here." Neither of them could have known, standing in that quiet garden room with the afternoon light slanting gently through the windows, that this conversation was the true beginning of everything that would follow. Not the incident in the kitchen, not the headlines, not even the broken engagement. A billionaire finally learning to see the people who had always been standing right in front of him. 6 months passed. Maya was enrolled in an accelerated nursing program at a college 40 minutes from the estate, her tuition and books fully covered, her schedule arranged so she could balance classes with a lighter, redefined role at the Whitfield house. No longer housekeeping duties, but managing the household's small internal foundation that Nate had established in the wake of everything that happened, dedicated to supporting domestic workers who had experienced mistreatment in wealthy households across the It had started as Nate's idea, born out of guilt and a desperate need to turn something ugly into something meaningful. But it had become, over time, something Maya was building alongside him. Her lived experience shaping every policy, every resource, every intake process designed to make sure no one else endured what she had endured in silence for 3 years. Her mother's health had stabilized enough that she'd been moved from hospice care into a long-term facility closer to Maya's new apartment, a modest but comfortable place Maya had finally been able to afford on her own, thanks to her new position, though Nate had quietly offered to help cover the deposit before she'd firmly, gratefully declined. "I want to build this myself," she'd told him. "You've already given me the foundation. Let me lay the bricks." He had respected that without argument, something that told her more about who he truly was than any grand gesture could have. Vanessa, meanwhile, had disappeared almost entirely from the world Nate and Maya now moved through. The engagement had been formally, legally dissolved within a month of the incident. Her family's real estate business, hit hard by the fallout, had quietly relocated operations to a different state. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance would mention having seen her somewhere. A smaller city, a smaller life, a version of herself stripped of the platform she'd once used so carelessly. Nate never asked for details. Maya never brought her up unless necessary. Some chapters, they'd both silently agreed, simply didn't deserve more page space than they'd already taken. What surprised Maya most in the months that followed wasn't the material changes to her life. The tuition paid, the salary raised, the foundation built in her honor. It was the small, quiet friendship that had grown between her and Nate, built slowly out of mutual respect, rather than the imbalance of power that had once defined every interaction between them. They weren't anything more than that. Not yet, not in any way either of them had named out loud. But there was an ease between them now that hadn't existed before, born out of honesty instead of hierarchy. He asked about her nursing exams. She teased him gently about his terrible taste in ties. They had dinner together sometimes, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had walked through something painful together and come out the other side with a strange, unexpected understanding of one another. It was during one of those dinners, nearly 7 months after that Tuesday in the kitchen, that Nate finally said the thing he'd been carrying quietly for weeks. "I don't want you to feel any pressure to say anything back," he began carefully, setting down his fork, his usual boardroom confidence noticeably absent. "But I think I need to tell you that somewhere in the last several months, what I feel when I think about you stopped being about guilt or responsibility or making things right. It became something else. And I understand completely if that's not something you want to hear, given everything, given the power dynamic that still exists between us in some ways. I just didn't want to keep pretending I didn't feel it." Maya sat quietly for a long moment, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. "I've thought about it too," Maya finally admitted, her voice soft but steady. "More than I probably should have, given everything. I kept telling myself it didn't make sense, that it was just gratitude or trauma bonding or some complicated version of both. But it's not that. I know the difference now." Nate exhaled slowly, something in his shoulders loosening that Maya realized, watching him, had probably been tense for months without her noticing. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "You've been through enough upheaval this year. I don't need an answer tonight or even this month. I just needed you to know." "I appreciate that," Maya said, and then after a pause added with a small smile. "But for what it's worth, I don't need more time to know how I feel. I just needed someone to ask." It wasn't a dramatic, movie-perfect moment. No sweeping music, no grand declaration under falling snow. It was two people who had survived something ugly together, sitting at a quiet dinner table, choosing honesty over the comfortable silence they could have kept hiding behind instead. And somehow, that quiet honesty felt more powerful than any grand gesture could have. They took things slowly after that, deliberately, carefully, both of them aware of how easily power and vulnerability could tangle into something unhealthy if they weren't intentional about building something equal. Nate insisted Maya finish her nursing degree entirely on her own terms, refusing to let their relationship shortcut anything she was building for herself. Maya, in turn, made clear that she wasn't interested in being anyone's rescue story. She wanted to be seen as a whole person, not a headline, not a cautionary tale, not a symbol of redemption for a man trying to outrun his past mistakes. A year after the incident that had once threatened to define her, Maya walked across a graduation stage and received her nursing degree. Her mother watching proudly from a wheelchair in the front row, healthier now than she'd been in years, thanks to consistent, quality care that had once felt impossibly out of reach. Nate sat beside her, not as a billionaire fiancé, not as a symbol of guilt repaid, but simply as someone who loved her and had shown up, consistently, in all the ordinary ways that mattered most. The foundation they'd built together had grown far beyond the walls of the Whitfield estate. What started as an internal policy shift within one household had become a non-profit organization supporting domestic workers across 3 states, offering legal resources, emergency housing assistance, and educational grants for staff members looking to build lives beyond the households that employed them. Maya became its executive director within the year, her own story, painful as its beginning had been, becoming a source of strength for hundreds of others who finally felt seen in a system that had ignored them for far too long. And Vanessa. She became, eventually, little more than a distant chapter in a story that had grown into something none of them could have predicted that Tuesday afternoon. A cautionary tale whispered occasionally at Connecticut dinner parties, a name that occasionally resurfaced when someone Googled the Whitfield family history out of idle curiosity. She never publicly apologized. She never reached out again after that single unanswered text. And in the end, that absence said more about who she truly was than any statement ever could have. 2 years after that Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen, Maya stood in front of a small crowd gathered in a community center just outside Hartford. Not a mansion this time, not marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but a modest room with folding chairs and a podium borrowed from the local library. She was there to speak at the opening of the Foundation's newest resource center, the fifth one they'd built in 2 years, this one specifically designed to support live-in domestic workers who had experienced abuse or exploitation in the households they served. 2 years ago, Maya began, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been the last time she'd stood in front of a room full of strangers. I was tied to a chair in a kitchen that wasn't mine, in a house I'd given 3 years of my life to, by someone who believed my dignity was less important than her convenience. I want to tell you that story today not because I want your pity, but because I want you to understand that what happened to me happens, in smaller and larger ways, to people every single day, in houses just like the ones many of you have worked in. And most of the time nobody ever hears about it. Most of the time there's no dramatic ending, no public reckoning, no foundation built in someone's name. She paused, scanning the room. Faces of former domestic workers, social workers, advocates who had spent years fighting for protections most people never thought twice about. What I want you to take from my story isn't the ending. It's this. Dignity isn't something that should ever depend on someone else's mercy. It shouldn't require a billionaire walking through the right door at the right moment for a person's suffering to finally matter. Every single person deserves to be treated with respect, in every house, in every job, regardless of who's watching or who might intervene. That's what this center is for. That's what all of this has always been for. In the back of the room, Nate stood quietly, not at the podium, not seeking any recognition for his role in building what stood behind Maya that day. He had learned over the past 2 years that the most meaningful thing he could do wasn't to be the hero of this story. It was to make sure the story never needed a hero in the first place, to build systems sturdy enough that dignity didn't depend on luck or timing or the right person walking through the right door. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed into the warm afternoon, Maya found him near the back, and he pulled her gently into a hug, careful and familiar in the way that comes from 2 years of steady, honest love built on the foundation of surviving something painful together and choosing, every day since, not to let that pain define what came next. "You did that," he whispered against her hair. Hair that had long since grown back, longer and fuller than it had ever been before, a quiet, permanent reminder of everything she had survived and everything she had built since. "Every bit of that was you." "We did that," Maya corrected softly. "Together." And maybe that was the real ending to this story. Not a wedding, not a fairy tale rescue, but 2 people who had walked through something ugly and chosen, deliberately every single day afterward, to build something better out of the wreckage. A reminder that dignity should never be optional. That kindness should never depend on who's watching. And that sometimes, the worst moment of someone's life can become the exact turning point that changes hundreds of other lives they'll never even meet. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to remember one thing. The way we treat people when we think no one important is watching says more about who we are than anything else ever could. If you felt something while listening to this, please hit that like button. It truly helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more emotional, real stories like this one every week. And if someone in your life needs a reminder tonight that their dignity matters, no matter their job title or their paycheck, share this story with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next one.